Hey everybody, Mr. Lewis here, ready to finish up with our last video lecture of Unit 2 covering sections 8 and 9, the effects of government intervention in markets and international trade and public policy. Now, we actually already covered a little bit of this international trade stuff at the end of yesterday's notes when we looked at shortages and how sometimes shortages are imported from other countries to meet the gap in quantity supplied and quantity demanded. So we've already gotten a little bit into that. Our main focus is going to be here in section 2.8. So let's take a look. There are a few different types of government intervention that we will look at today, and they're listed here. So the government has 6 basic tools that we need to know in terms of how they might intervene in a given marketplace. We've been creating this marketplace for ourselves throughout the unit. Now we see the government stepping in to try and improve, in some cases, the efficiency in that market. And they might do this through a few different tools at their disposal. One is called a price floor. This is setting the price above an equilibrium. A price ceiling, on the other hand, is setting a price below the equilibrium. A quota might be controlling the quantity in a market. And then we have taxes and subsidies. A per unit tax adds to producers' marginal cost of production or marginal private cost, MPC, whereas a per unit subsidy subtracts from producers' marginal cost of production. And then finally, the government can use tariffs, which are essentially just taxes, but applied to foreign goods, and this would charge for each unit imported into a market. So let's take a look at each of these a little bit further. Price floors, as I mentioned, increase the market price, and the logic behind this is that by keeping prices artificially high, producers are going to benefit. If the government is keeping a price higher, that's not going to benefit consumers, it's benefiting producers. And an example of this might be something like minimum wage. So, in a labor market, the workers are actually the producers and the employers are the ones paying for something, right? Well, if the government feels that the equilibrium wage is too low, they might set a floor or a minimum wage in that market. Now, the effects of this are a higher price or wage in the market, less consumer surplus as a result. It's also going to result in a surplus in terms of quantity demanded being less than quantity supplied, which is going to create inefficiency or disequilibrium and leads to something that we call dead weight loss. DWL is how we commonly denote dead weight loss. Dead weight loss is a sign, it's a red flag that we are at some kind of inefficient point in the market. We're not achieving the socially optimal outcome. We're not achieving the allocatively efficient or best outcome in that market. And so you can see some of the different minimum wages set around the country here, and feel free to take a look. There are some pretty stark contrasts when you go from, say, Indiana at $7.25 over to California, $13, or Washington State, $13.50. But of course, the cost of living is different in different places, right? And we could have this conversation for an ample amount of time, but really what I want to focus on is not just necessarily wages and things like that, but more so how this plays out in the market itself. So let's take a look at this visually. We have our market on the x-axis quantity, on the y-axis price and cost, dollars. Here's our supply curve. Here's our demand curve. And remember, our supply curve is also marginal private cost. That's what determines willingness to accept for a producer, which then determines our supply curve itself. And for consumers, the demand curve is derived from the marginal private benefit that consumers experience from this good. So our demand curve itself and the shape it takes on, or consumers' willingness to pay for the good, is determined by marginal private benefit. So we've got demand, we've got supply. Here's the equilibrium price and quantity. There's consumer surplus, here's producer surplus. And this is where we want to be at equilibrium. But if the government feels that that price is too low, they may set a floor. The reason we call it a floor is because you can't go beneath the floor. And the government doesn't want the price going below this price. We're just calling it P sub F right now for price floor. And when that happens, think about how this is going to affect everybody. The consumers from here to here, this portion of the demand curve, whereas they were willing to pay P sub E, they're not going to pay P sub F. And so as a result, consumer surplus and the quantity in the market are both going to be limited. Consumers are not going to purchase as much of this good, and they'll only buy Q2 instead of QE. And then suppliers, on the other hand, are going to want to sell more because as price goes up, quantity supplied increases. All of these producers who weren't willing to sell it at P sub E are now willing to sell it at P sub F, and the result is a surplus, where quantity demanded is less than quantity supplied. And consumer surplus then would be limited to this area up here. And keep in mind, because there are less consumers in the market, all of these producers aren't going to have a consumer to sell to. Even though they would like to at this higher price, we don't have anyone to sell to. So producers from here to here, the same number of consumers that we see on the demand curve who are willing to pay this much for the good, they will find someone to sell to. But all of these producers on this stretch of the supply curve are going to go without potential consumers. Now, before I talk about this big question mark area here, look at producer surplus. In order to calculate properly producer surplus, we would have to split this area into a triangle down here and this rectangle that's left over, calculate the area of either one, I should say both of them, and then add them together. That's how we would find producer surplus in that scenario. But let's talk about this triangle. What is this? Well, before the price floor was implemented, this entire area was consumer and producer surplus, right? This entire triangle to the left of our equilibrium. Now, though, consumer surplus is up here, producer surplus is down here, but there's a big gap. There's something missing. That loss in market surplus, the loss in benefits either to consumers or producers, or in reality both, is what we call dead weight loss. That is not just a symbol of the lost surplus from equilibrium to where we are now. It's also a symbol of inefficiency in the market. We're at disequilibrium, right? There's inefficiency. We don't want to be here. And so the dead weight loss is a measurement of that. So dead weight loss, as it says here, is simply a measure of the market surplus that is lost as a result of the government intervening in this market. So a price ceiling works pretty similar, actually. Okay, a price ceiling is simply decreasing market price. And the logic behind this is that by keeping price artificially low, we're going to help consumers afford this good, whereas maybe some of them couldn't before or weren't willing to buy it at the higher price, right? An example of this is rent control. In some areas around the country, we find that the government actually limits how much landlords are allowed to charge for monthly rent. And again, the logic behind this is that consumers will benefit, right? People will be able to afford housing, and maybe they can spend their money elsewhere. Maybe some people who wouldn't have been able to afford housing at all now could. That's the logic behind this. But the effects are a lower price, less producer surplus, and because of that, a shortage. Some producers who aren't experiencing as much surplus as they were before, or have a willingness to accept that is too high, will leave the market. And some consumers who can now afford this good because of the lower price will now enter the market, and the result will be a shortage, a gap, creating inefficiency and thus disequilibrium. Along with that, dead weight loss. So if you look around the country on this map here, the areas that have this orangish color and then shaded in with diagonal lines as well, rent control is actually prohibited. The orange solid areas, rent control is permitted, but not established. And then the areas that are white, a solid white color, rent control is permitted and established in some municipalities. If it's a white state, like Oregon here specifically, with the diagonal lines, okay, on this map, then it means that they implement statewide rent control. So, in other words, the states that are filled in with white on this map have some level of rent control. The states that are filled in with orange really don't use rent control. And so, as you can see, not many states actually implement this idea of a price ceiling when it comes to rent, but some do. And as you might be able to pick out here, it's some states in which there are large metropolitan areas that have very, very high housing costs. But there are also some metropolitan areas that have high housing costs that do not have rent control implemented. So it's a state by state thing. And this is one example of a price ceiling. And in San Francisco, for example, one of the cities in which rent control has been discussed at length and debated at length, a 2-bedroom apartment from 2011 up through 2019 basically doubled in terms of price per month. And that would be one of the calls for some type of rent control or a price ceiling, or this would be one of the arguments or some of the data that someone might use in arguing for rent control, that this inflation of rent calls for some government intervention. Now, let's take a look on our graph of how that would actually play out. Here's the y-axis, the x-axis, we've got supply, we've got demand. Here's our equilibrium, consumer surplus and producer surplus, all good. This is where the market is telling us they are socially optimal, but the government feels that this price has simply gotten to be too high. And because of that, they establish what we call a price ceiling, a price that is lower than the equilibrium. So once they do this, think about this section of the supply curve. All of these producers who at equilibrium were willing to accept the price are no longer willing to do so, and all of these producers are going to drop out, whereas all of these consumers from this point at the equilibrium down to this point on the demand curve are now saying, yeah, we'll buy this thing, we're willing to pay P sub C, that price, and so we're pushing away producers, we're drawing in consumers. That results in a shortage. This would be the new quantity, Q2, because, simply put, there aren't any producers offering beyond Q2 at this point. These producers have dropped out of the market. Maybe they're using their buildings for something else. Who knows? But only Q2 will get sold in this market. Over here, this quantity is what consumers want to buy, and the difference between those two things is our shortage. Now, producer surplus has been limited, right, to this area because these are the only producers who are still willing to participate in this market. Because of that, consumer surplus is going to take on this odd shape. Only the consumers from here to here, where we match with the number of producers in the market, left in the market, only these consumers are going to have somewhere to buy this product from, right? Someone to buy this product from. All of these consumers from this point down to this point are left stranded. They don't have anywhere to buy this particular good because Q2 is what's being produced. Because of that, we have this loss in market surplus, and that would be our dead weight loss. The final one that I want to talk about today is quota. We're going to stop after quota, and I'm going to ask you to do a few levels to practice these 3 items today. So let's talk about quota, and then tomorrow we'll get into taxes, subsidies, and tariffs. A quota is simply limiting or controlling quantity in some way. So By keeping output limited, for example, the government feels that society will benefit in some way. One example of this is taxi medallions. The government, in many cases, and many municipalities, and to different degrees, only offers a certain number of licenses or permits, or in this case, we call them medallions, to taxi drivers. They don't want there to be a million taxis on the road. And you want to be able to regulate the taxis that are on the road. So in some cases, like you can see here with New York City, taxi medallions are limited. And what's essentially happening in the market is that we're achieving or implementing a decreased quantity in the market. So this is going to increase the price of this good, and we're going to see that on the graph. And that's going to create this inefficiency because the price and quantity aren't where equilibrium would have them. So with a quota, we've got demand, supply, dollars on the y-axis, quantity on the x. There's consumer surplus and producer surplus. But what if this quantity is artificially limited? Essentially what the government is doing is creating a perfectly inelastic supply curve, right? And what we would want to do at this point is look at where this new artificial supply curve intersects with our demand curve. And that happens here. So that is going to be our new price. And at this price, we can see that consumers are only going to be willing to pay P2, only consumers who are willing to pay P2 and up are going to actually consume this good. Producers who are willing to accept here to here and are able to find a consumer to sell to will still be good to go in this market. But remember, sometimes the producer itself is the government, so there could be different scenarios. Either way, what's happened is we've created this loss in market surplus here, which is our deadweight loss. And again, we have a form of government intervention resulting in deadweight loss. All right, that's it for the first three types of government intervention today. Please take a look at the first three levels that go with each of these government actions. And then tomorrow, we'll finish up with the last three types of government intervention. And next week, we'll move into Unit 2 review, and you can plan on testing over Unit 2 next Wednesday. All right, thanks for tuning in, everyone, and I will see you tomorrow.